Okay, so thank you, Lee, for continuing the series with such an interesting insight into Brother Malik. Really interesting and informative take on his life. If it's okay, I just want to spend about 20 minutes or so just dissecting and expanding on some of your points, as well as some of the themes that you've touched on in the book. I know that everyone has got a lot of questions. I've seen a lot going on in the chat, but obviously being the host, I'm privileged to be able to speak to you first. So my first question is, as someone who became such a committed Pan-Africanist, how important do you think that Malcolm's visits to Africa and his conversations with African leaders were in terms of influencing his position?
Well, I think they were very important. I think they were extraordinarily important. And I think if you were to ask many Black Americans today who have been to Black Africa, any part of it, they will tell you it was an eye-opening experience. There was, and probably there continues to be, so much racist baggage about Black Africa, as there was about Black America, that many Black people were and probably still are not aware of the racist myths. Many Black Americans are not aware of the racist myths they carry about Black Africa until, or unless and until they've been to Africa. Unless and until they see the complexity of Black Africa. So I think for Malcolm, particularly in the 1960s, when a very small number of Black Americans had been to Black Africa, and the propaganda, the racist propaganda about Africa was so pervasive. I think it was eye-opening. It was as important as his going to Mecca, to see the variety of life in Black Africa, to see the variety of Black people in Black Africa, to see how Black people, Black Africans looked, how Black Africans carried themselves, how Black communities in Black Africa were organized. I think, all of that was very important. I mean, people talk about, of course, his meeting with, the prominent leaders and so forth of Black African nations. But I think it was equally important that he set foot on the ground and, perhaps driving to see Nkrumah, of which there is no record of what he and Nkrumah talked about when he went to see Nkrumah, but simply of his driving to see Nkrumah through the streets, of seeing the streets, I think was tremendously important.
So then would you then say for anybody wanting to work in the kind of Pan-African space at all, that it's very important for them to visit the continent then? In the same
absolutely. I mean, it's very important for people in general to travel, right? It's very important for Americans, Black Americans especially, to travel outside of this country. It's very important, yes, for Black Americans to travel to Black Africa. It's very important for Black Americans to travel everywhere, because, America is such a provincial place in many ways. We have no, I think still to this day, many people have no experience have not the same kind of experiences that the other world has, which is to say, the cross-border experience. So that, you know, if you're in Nigeria, well, it's nothing to think of going to South Africa. Just as if you're in Italy, it's nothing to think of going to Germany, where customs are different, languages are different, so forth and so on, right? Americans are historically very provincial in those terms. And to have the experience, if you're going to, especially if you're going to work in the Pan-Africanist space, to have the experience of seeing how the rest of the world lives is enormously important.
Okay, and then in turn, what would you say that Malcolm's influence was on Pan-African political thought?
I think, you know, I hesitate on that, in part because of what I just said, which is to say, I would like to hear what people of African descent outside of America think his influence was. Speaking from someone inside the United States, I think Malcolm's influence was that Black Americans are interested in you, right? We recognize where we came from, and we want to talk with you about it, right? I think that was that. For those of you who are not as old as I am, I'm 73. It is hard to imagine. You can read it in the books, but it is hard to imagine how deeply and pervasively racist the view of Black Africa was in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s. It was only when Malcolm went and the civil rights legislation in the United States had passed, and so you began to get the Black cultural revolution here, that view of Black Africa, Blacks began to challenge that view of Black Africa because they themselves were adopting the view that Malcom X had, right? So he was an enormously important figure in those terms.
Another thing that you discuss in the book is Malcolm X's, is how his commitment to Pan-Africanism very much went against the mainstream civil rights movement and their kind of relative silence on the issue. And you also seem to assert that they were right to be silent on this area. Could you just explain a little bit why, in terms of why you believe this to be the case, that this was the correct stance for them to take?
Yes, because of what I just said regarding the pervasiveness of the racist view of Black Africa in the United States then, and because the civil rights movement could not take on Pan-Africanism when Black Americans had no civil rights white people needed to respect. Right? They had no civil rights white people needed to respect by law in the South. They had no civil rights white people needed to respect in the North. Yes, you had the laws on the books about, you know, laws against housing discrimination, but everybody knew that was just paper, right? That in fact, the ghettos, the Black American ghettos were a creation of the North. in the early 20th century. Right? Housing discrimination, job discrimination, and the tarring of the movement as being communist inspired was a heavy burden to carry, especially during the McCarthy era. And so to talk about a quote unquote foreign movement or a movement tied to Black Africa was, politically speaking, not going to get you anywhere in the United States of America in terms of the movement. Now, some people will remember that King did go, I think, to Ghana when Nkrumah was inaugurated. And a few of the leadership, I think, sent congratulations and so forth. But they were very circumspect about that. And for reasons that I just articulated, they were right to do so. Now, as soon as, it's important to note that as soon as the civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as soon as those were passed, the Black Cultural Revolution, which was deeply Pan-Africanist in cultural style, kicked off, right? Yes, they were absolutely right from a pragmatic point of view to not try to take on the Pan-Africanist movement until they got their civil rights.
Okay, so this dichotomy then in terms of how Malcolm X seemed to want Black Americans to see themselves and how many of them did see themselves. So American people of African descent, or as he wanted them to proclaim, we are an African people. This is still something that's quite prevalent today. So do you think that Pan-Africanism can still be achieved so long as this way of self-identifying is held in terms of being a Black American first before an African?
I would have to say, as with all peoples of African descent in the diaspora, and even on the continent, that is something that has to be worked out. It's not a future that I can see in hard terms, simply because of for two reasons. Simply because of the way the structure of the world is now in terms of nation states. And the other is because people have to sort through the differences among people of African descent and whether those differences are simply a matter of cultural style, of, a kind of lighthearted allegiance to the nation state you happen to have been born in, or whether there's something deeper. And if that is so, just because Black Americans have decided in mass terms they are Americans of African descent, does that block them from participating in joint Pan-Africanist undertakings around the world? I don't have the answer for that. But I think those are some of the questions about, the Pan-Africanist future.
I'm going to just ask you one more question before I open it up to everyone else. So had Malcolm's life not been so tragically cut short, what do you think that he perhaps could have achieved with another 20, 30 years or so?
There are two answers to that. I think one is that people should consider the life of Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, who was the Mexican-American civil rights activist who organized a movement of the farm workers in California in the 1960s. And it drew tremendous amount of attention in the 1960s. And then Cesar Chavez seemed to disappear. When Cesar Chavez died about a decade or so ago, in America, many people thought he had died long ago. But Cesar Chavez had kept working in the fields in California, organizing farm workers all that time. The second thing I think of whenever that question is asked is, what would the shape-shifted massive resistance, the forces of the shape-shifted massive resistance dynamic have done? You know, that question can go to, why was Malcolm killed when he was killed? Just as that question can go to, why was King killed when he was killed? Right? I wrote in my essay on King that King was killed at the right time. He was killed before the scandals about his philandering could be made public. If the scandals about his philandering had been made public in the winter of 1968, King would have been finished. The movement would have been deeply damaged, regardless of how many Black people said they no longer pledged allegiance to Martin Luther King. The movement would have been deeply damaged. What would have happened to Malcolm had he lived? One can't consider that question without those two questions that I asked. Why was he killed when he was killed? And without considering, you know, the forces of evil that were arrayed against Black people then, stretching from the FBI to what we would call today dark money groups. All of that, it is still difficult to contemplate the enormity of the forces which were arrayed against Black people then. Just as a sidelight that illuminates that. When I was in college in the late 1960s, we used to joke about, you know, our rooms being bugged by the FBI. When we were sitting at the dining tables, there being microphones under the dining tables, of our being watched as we walked across campus. Well, in the early to late 1970s, the stuff started coming out about how widely Black Americans, college students, people in communities, community organizations, how widely they were watched. We know that the FBI had informants in the Nation of Islam, just as they had informants in SCLC and undoubtedly in all the other organizations, right? The enormity of that can lead one to the conclusion that Malcolm was not going to live long, no matter what. So it's an interesting exercise to ponder what Malcolm would have accomplished had he lived. But I think the reality of it was that he was not going to live much longer, just as the reality of it for me was that King was not going to live much longer. Their time was up.
Okay, well, Lee, thank you once again for your viewpoints, for your analysis. We've said it previously and we'll say it again. We're very grateful to have people like yourself just uncovering these histories and narratives to help us contextualize Pan-Africanism correctly. So we very much appreciate your thoughts on the life of Malcolm, Malik, and his legacy.